October 10th, 1927, New Zealand. The Otago Daily Times would release an article detailing some very odd ghostly encounters happening around the town of Waihi. And these stories were actually creepy enough that most of the town's residents started going inside their homes before dark and locking their doors, afraid of what was lurking outside. And at one point, it led to around 35 men armed with clubs patrolling the town looking for these ghastly spirits. So suffice to say, the town was on edge. But what was causing such alarm? Well, for that, there were numerous stories. One of the earlier ones told of a doctor driving to a patient's house late one night, since this was at the time when doctors would make house calls, and on his way, he saw a figure dressed as a ghost, just like you may have seen in the movies, and it was standing right there in the middle of the road, sorta in a dramatic kind of pose, like he was trying to make himself scarier. The doctor pulled his car up to where he stood, but the ghost darted off the side of the road into the bush. So the doctor got out and began looking for him, but whatever it was no longer in the bush. And actually, it was nowhere near at all, as the doctor could not find one sign that anyone had even been standing there. During that same week, a youth going home from a dance he had attended suddenly would see a white-robed figure running down a park, which he found odd since it was around 2 a.m. when this occurred. This kid ended up running home in fear and never got close enough to get a good description. A few days later, very early in the morning, at about 3:30 a.m., a woman would look outside to see the street lights being turned off for the day, and it was a few minutes after these lights were turned off that she noticed something on her porch. She got quiet and began watching this silhouette that she could not quite make out. That's when she seen the flash of an electric torch, which was followed by a hissing noise. All of a sudden, the door to her home was blown open by the wind, and an apparition came in and stood at her bedroom door for a few moments, just staring. She reported he was wearing a skull cap with white streaks and was wearing a dark suit. She knew she was not dreaming or suffering from sleep paralysis because she was awake when she heard the heavy wind blow the front door open. There were other occupants in the home at the time, but she was so afraid she couldn't even speak to alert them. There is no conclusion in this one, but I assume this ghostly figure just left her be. And that's pretty much it. Police did actually search around when all this was going on, but they stated they did not believe it was anything supernatural at all. And as far as theories go, there's basically only two. We'll start with the one from the police first. It was almost certainly nothing paranormal, and instead, the work of a prankster, or maybe multiple pranksters, using theatrical props like phosphorescent clothing, mask, and of course on the last one, using a blowtorch and or something else to make the mechanical hissing sound. The other theory, of course, is, well, it was something paranormal. The only real evidence for that is, the sightings kept popping up pretty persistently over this little time period, and in the case of the doctor, when he got out to search for this being, there was not one piece of evidence that anyone had even been in the area. So how did this person, presumably wearing a ghost costume, escape into the night so easily just by running into a bush? The Flat Earth conspiracy is well known among conspiracy theorists as one of the more laughable ones, but it is taken quite seriously by a sizable minority. But what if I told you there is an even crazier take on the Flat Earth conspiracy? That brings us to our next topic, the Great Ice Ball Earth Theory, where basically Earth is part of a ginormous planet that just happens to be completely frozen, and Earth, because of the sun's rays, is thawed out, leaving us in this very tiny corner of this uninhabited ball of ice. It also confirms the Flat Earth Theory, because what we see as our Earth takes up such a tiny portion of this planet that there is no curve. It's a little bit more difficult to explain, so this visual will help a lot. But this would also explain the theory that flat earthers use, that the Earth is completely surrounded by ice, because, well, in this scenario, we would be. Think of it as a massive ball of ice with a sun-melted pond where life exists. The sun moves in a circle above that spot in the pond, which explains our day and night cycles. And there are other ponds that exist on this ice globe, but due to the distance and extreme cold temperatures, we just can't reach them. And in some variations of this theory, the government or powers that be are trying to hide these other ponds. This theory, I believe, is more of a meme theory to make fun of flat earthers by taking it to extreme lengths. Although some flat earthers do believe it, which means they actually believe the earth is round, just much larger and made of ice. Regardless, it would make a good setting for a D&D campaign. August 7th, 1947, Buenos Aires, Argentina. An air flight known as the Stardust would disembark with 11 people, 5 crew and 6 passengers, headed for Santiago, Chile. The plane actually belonged to British South American Airways, and thus was captained by former Royal Air Force pilot Reginald Cook, who saw combat experience in World War II, as did a few members of the crew. The passengers were made up of 1 woman and 5 men, 1 from Palestine, 1 from Switzerland, 1 from Germany, and the rest were all from Britain. Now, one of these British passengers in particular was special, as he was a diplomatic courier known as the King's Messenger, someone that takes secret important documents to British embassies around the world. It was 1:46 p.m. when this leg of the flight began, and was in all ways uneventful. But that would change at 5:41 p.m. when a Morse code was sent to the airport in Santiago announcing their expected arrival in 4 minutes at 5:45 p.m. But as that time came and went, the plane never arrived, and with no more radio transmissions or responses from the crew, a search was started immediately, which found nothing, as this was pretty rough mountainous terrain. The intense search carried on for the next 5 days, and at one point, they became excited when an amateur radio operator came forward and claimed he had received a faint SOS signal from the Stardust, which of course meant it was possible they all survived, but they could never verify that this operator really heard this signal, nor could they find the aircraft. This of course started to lead to theories on what had actually happened, which ranged from sabotage, or that maybe the aircraft was blown up to destroy whatever diplomatic documents was being carried by the King's Messenger. There were also the more fanciful theories that it had been destroyed by a UFO. However, the most likely theory came out about 50 years later, when 2 mountaineers climbing Mount Tupangado, about 50 miles east of Santiago, found the aircraft engine along with twisted pieces of metal and shreds of clothing. A year later, an army expedition found the propeller and wheels, and 2 years after that, remains began being recovered and were identified through DNA. An investigation on the ground revealed that the crash was very localized, which meant that the plane had a head-on impact with the ground, thus ruling out a mid-air explosion. In addition, the propeller showed that the engine had been running at a near cruising speed at the time of the impact, and the wheels proved that the undercarriage was retracted, suggesting it was not an attempt at an emergency landing, and more likely a controlled flight into the terrain. So flight crash investigators soon put together a theory. They believed during the final portion of the descent, the heavy clouds blocked visibility on the ground, which would have made it more difficult to navigate, but it was also possible that the aircraft flew through a jet stream, something not understood in 1947. And in those, high altitude winds can blow in different directions constantly, and would have put the aircraft flying directly into the headwind, dramatically decreasing the speed. And if the captain thought they were going faster than they really were and began their descent, while they also couldn't see because of the clouds, then you can see how this might lead to a disaster, crashing right into the mountain. However, that theory is hotly debated, as some pilots have pointed out that Captain Cook would have never began his descent without having some kind of idea that he for sure made it across the mountains. They instead believed the strong winds actually brought the craft down, as one pilot that has flew in that area stated that they had been told not to enter the clouds over the mountains because the turbulence and ice was too risky. As far as to why the debris wasn't found for a long time, that would be because it flew into a glacier, which then caused an avalanche, burying the craft. And by 2000, the Argentinian Air Force declared that the craft crashed because of a heavy snowstorm and cloudy weather, which led to the crew being unable to correct their position. So I know you're thinking, well, this one isn't much of a mystery. We pretty much know what happens. But that is not the mystery on this one. Instead, it's the weird message the Santiago airport received before all this happened. As mentioned, the last message from Stardust to Ground Control was stating they would be there at 5:45 p.m. However, I left out a key part earlier. The original message sent by Morse code actually said ETA Santiago 5:45 STENDEC. This STENDEC, spelled STENDEC, was not understood, and at first, the radio operator thought he heard a mistake since it came in very fast, although he did hear them loud and clear, but he would call out to Stardust again and ask them to clarify the last word, to which the Stardust replied twice, STENDEC, STENDEC, and that was the last message they ever sent. And to this day, no one knows what was meant by that message, and there's been many theories proposed over the decades. In fact, for the longest time, this STENDEC message is why the UFO theory was proposed. Although to me, I don't know why STENDEC would absolutely mean UFO. But anyways, after the discovery of the craft in the late 90s, new theories began to emerge, such as the crew may have been suffering from hypoxia from being too high up in the air, and the operator was not thinking clearly and was trying to send the word descent, but instead sent STENDEC. Another theory suggested that STENDEC may have been some obscure phrase that the Chilean radio operator had just never heard before, like STENDEC standing for Santiago Tower Message Now Entering Cloud, or some variation of that, while others think the operator had simply misheard STENDEC. However, all three of these were basically ruled out, since the crew did send it 3 times in a row without correcting it. Likewise, acronyms would have been highly unusual and convoluted. Investigators have stated it was possible there was some misunderstanding on the Morse code, but it was very doubtful. This led to what is considered the most likely theory today. If the operator did not misunderstand them, it's most likely he was just sent incorrectly. In Morse code, you can't just rely on dots and dashes, you also have to put spaces in between them. It tells you when one letter ends and the next begins, and if this is off slightly, the message can be misinterpreted. And STENDEC happens to use the same combination of dots and dashes as the following: SCTIAR. The SCTI is the airport code Los Cerrillos in Santiago, while the AR is Morse code for over. But here's the catch: although the two words STENDEC and SCTIAR share the same combination of dots and dashes, they use different spacing, which if not done properly can turn one word into the other. Likewise, STENDEC is just one character off from the spelling VALP, which is the call sign for the airport at Valparaiso, about 70 miles north of Santiago. Or possibly, they meant to send the word FTA late, a common Royal Air Force method for signaling a late arrival, and is similar to STENDEC. So whoever sent the message sent it in a hurry, or they were being lazy about it, and or never realized they even did it. Regardless, it does appear that they did not expect the crash. Berrien County, Michigan, a location rich with folklore and an urban legend that may have became real. It started sometime around the late 19th century, when stories began being shared around town about a demonic phantom skater that lurked around Hickory Creek in the wintertime. Of course, it was more of a way for parents to just tell their children, "You better come home before dark, or the phantom skater will get you." But what makes this one interesting is something that would happen on January 30th, 1963, when a local newspaper writer, Ben Nottingham, would do an interview with local resident, 84-year-old Harvey Seasongood, which detailed his real encounter with the phantom skater when he was a young boy. Harvey actually spent most of his time like most boys in rural areas. He fished and swam at Hickory Creek, and even skated when it was froze over in the winter, as he only lived about a half a mile from it. But it was what happened in 1888 that got a lot of curious readers' attention. According to Harvey, on that night, him and some other kids in the neighborhood went skating on the frozen creek, laughing and playing and just having fun in general, but they began to lose track of time, and before they even realized it, it was dark. It was then sometime downstream, they heard a weird noise. It was an eerie scraping noise that echoed through the frozen air. Harvey would go on to describe it as the sounds of skates on ice. The children who had been told this story of the phantom skater their whole childhood, now panicked. They began running up the knee-deep snowbank and made it to the top where it was fenced off by barbed wire. Some of the children scaled the fence, while the younger ones crawled under it. Harvey was of the latter group. Unfortunately, he became entangled in the fence and began trying to wiggle free. By this time, the other children had ran home, while poor Harvey lay there struggling. Hearing the noise get closer, Harvey would then twist around in his jacket, which was still caught in the fence, and stared down at the river bend. There it came into view, the phantom skater. It was close to 20 feet tall, wore black tights and a black skull cap. And although the moon was out bright, this figure cast no shadow. The skater's enormous blade sparked green and blue flames as it moved. Harvey remained silent and crouched down as he watched the entity approach an old timber bridge, where it then leaped into the air, clearing the bridge in a single jump. The blades, which were bonded to cloven hooves, landed and a bunch of sparks melted the surrounding snow. It then continued down Hickory Creek with its massive strides, leaving an eerie glow of green sparks and blue flames before it disappeared around the bend. Harvey then escaped and made it home, and talked to the other children about it the next day, and they all claimed they did hear the scraping of the skates go by. And that's pretty much it. And we go to theories. So suffice to say, you probably know what the main theory is. Yep, Harvey was known locally as a good storyteller, and he wasn't shy about embellishing an event. He would even later on claim that he had also seen a giant bird here at one point. So knowing all of that, more than likely he took a town urban legend and made his own version of it. Or maybe he just hallucinated the whole thing due to the fear of being left behind in the dark at this creek where the locals had told this story for so long. Or maybe he just seen a real animal go by, and again, due to the anxiety and the darkness, exaggerated many of the details. Others wonder if he really did see some kind of supernatural entity, possibly a demonic spirit or a ghost. In the mid-1980s, a man living on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, named Joe Matheson, had fell asleep listening to the storm outside, along with his girlfriend Melody and her 2 children. It was sometime around midnight when Joe would awaken, but not from the storm. Actually, he didn't know what had woke him up, but he sat up in bed and just happened to look out the window towards the garden, and that's when he noticed the yard was lit up by the motion light. So now he was curious as to what was moving around out there, but what he seen next, no one could have prepared him for. About 10 feet from the window, going from right to left, was a group of about 4 to 5 goblin-type beardless men that stood around 3.5 foot tall. They were very skinny and had oversized narrow faces with big ears, large noses, and strange eyes. Their clothes were plain, but he remarked that it looked like something from one of the Robin Hood movies in the 1950s. He went on to describe them looking like they were made of felt and being different shades of green and brown. They were also wearing triangular hats, but carried no weapons or tools. They also wore sock-like booties with pointed toes, which curled upwards. But that's not even the oddest part. The beings walked in an unnatural way, like they moved way too slowly, or at points they leaned way too forward, to such an extent that it didn't even seem possible. But then again, none of this did. But these beings seemed to have a leader, which the rest of the group followed as they made their way to a creek, and that leader turned around and made eye contact with Joe and smiled, like he was saying, "I know a secret that you don't." Joe immediately shook Melody awake and told her there were leprechauns outside, but by the time Melody had spun around to see, they had already vanished. She told Joe to go back to sleep, assuming he had been dreaming, but Joe could not sleep. He laid there for a couple minutes, and he started to concede that maybe it was his imagination playing tricks on him. But just as he thought that, he heard an awful scream coming from the horse corral in the direction that those beings had been walking towards. Joe got up, threw his water boots on, grabbed a flashlight, and ran outside into the pouring rain. But as he was leaving, he was joined by a neighbor named Sherry, who also kept a horse in that barn with Joe and Melody's. She was also wearing her rain gear and had heard all the commotion. When they got to the barn, it was Sherry's horse, which was pregnant at that time, that was very upset. She was kicking and snorting, which Joe and Sherry could see because of the lamp. As they were there trying to calm the horse down, another neighbor, a Mr. Bell, burst in irate, with rain dripping from his cowboy hat and denim jacket. He demanded to know what was going on, presumably upset because it had woken him up. Sherry explained that the horse was pregnant and might be about to give birth. Mr. Bell inspected the horse and told her that horse is far away from being due. After this, things calmed down for a second, and the three stood around talking in the barn, watching the rain get blown around by the wind. Mr. Bell then left, and after the horse calmed down, Joe and Sherry left the barn. But that's when they spotted something lit up by the lamp. A tiny pure white newborn male horse was laying dead, drowned in the only puddle in the corral. Sherry screamed and cried, and Joe was very confused. How did that foal get out of the barn? He couldn't have. Someone would have had to lifted it. Joe would remark after this, he began research and found that leprechauns, according to Judaic traditions of the ancient Celts, pure white male newborn livestock were perfect sacrificial victims. He also found in his research the sightings of little folk are omens for the death of livestock and failure of crops. Joe concluded his email to the channel that covered this story, Hammerson Peters. The little folk love running water, the dark, and horses. Where to even begin with theories on this one? We'll start with the obvious one. Joe made up the whole account and sent it to the popular YouTube channel, Hammerson Peters, and he himself most likely got the idea for the tale researching books on folklore. If it wasn't that, Joe could have been experiencing a hypnopompic hallucination, which is a vivid dream-like experience occurring upon awaking, sorta like sleep paralysis. Of course, this doesn't explain the rest of the story of him getting to the barn, the horse's scream, etc., etc. The real mystery is with Sherry's account of all this. She did not write into the channel, so it's hard to say if she witnessed the same thing or not. I mean, hypothetically, all she would have seen was the dead horse. She would have never seen the goblin creatures anyways, but it would be nice to know her account, because it's just as likely a wild animal got into the shed, got a hold of the foal, and dragged it outside, and then heard Joe come out, and the animal ran off. But unfortunately, the horse had been dropped into a mud puddle, which it then drowned in, because no one noticed until it was too late. Okay, I know these are the theories you're really waiting for. What if Joe actually had a paranormal experience? The unnatural movements he's seen, along with the leader turning around to smile at Joe, suggest they were aware of his presence. Were they from another realm or dimension? Were they fairies or goblins or leprechauns like Joe suggested? And finally, it may not be any of those. It could have just been an alien encounter, as this account matches up with the modern tales of aliens mutilating cows and horses. Sometime in the 740s AD, Ireland, we would get one of the stranger tales in history. The story comes to us from the Book of Leinster, an Irish manuscript compiled between the 12th and 13th centuries that detailed the weirdness that played out at the Telltale Assembly. According to the source, as the men were celebrating at this festival-type atmosphere, they looked out on the horizon and couldn't believe their eyes, because up in the air above them were 3 ships, apparently on a voyage in the air. Now we both know this is actually pretty strange, and you would think that it would have been written about in much more details. However, that was practically all that was said in this very first account, and it was simply forgotten about. However, in the Irish annals that would come after this, sometimes, many years later, the story would be told again and elaborated on in much more detail, sometimes changing dates. For example, it is sometimes told as 743 AD, sometimes as 744, and then sometimes you get 748 or 749, while other times it takes place in a different century altogether. The second account we have would do just that, because in the Book of Ballymote, a 14th century text, we would get the description that only one ship came sailing through over the assembly. However, this time, it was right in front of the Irish king. In this version, someone on the ship throws out a dart and hits a salmon. He then jumps off the ship and goes down to retrieve it from the ground right in front of the people of this assembly. When one of the men on the ground held onto the fish and refused to let the stranger take it, he screamed, "I am being drowned." It was then that the king stepped in and said, "Leave him alone," to which this strange individual swam through the air back to his ship. This would then be followed up by another account that basically kept all those details, except they took out the part about the king and the man on the ground. Then if we move forward a few more centuries, the story would evolve again. This time, it was said to have happened in Tailtown, at a church in Clonmacnoise, and that part of the story has remained until this day. Another detail they changed in this telling was instead of someone throwing a dart or fishing spear, the ship is now reported to have dropped an anchor, and upon seeing this, the priest ran out and grabbed it. But then, a man would jump from the ship up above and swim down, and when he sees the priest holding it, he protests and signals that he is drowning, and they let go of the anchor and he swims back with it up to the ship. And it's this version of the story that would go on to be famous, and it spread quickly throughout Europe, and would even have similar sightings throughout Britain, with at least one account in London in 1122 AD, then another account on a Sunday somewhere in Britain in the 12th century, when parishioners were leaving a local church and walked outside to see a dark and cloudy day, and stumbled upon a ship anchor embedded in a heap of stones in the churchyard, and a rope leading down to it from above. According to the manuscript, the people were amazed and stood around looking and talking about it. Then the rope moved, almost as if the crew were trying to free the anchor, but it would not budge. They then heard a voice from above, which sounded like the sailors were struggling to retrieve it. Finally, one of the sailors went down to get it. He lowered with the rope in one hand and began trying to shake the anchor free with the other, but the citizens all jumped in and began pulling him down to the ground. They held on to him and he began grasping for air, and then he suffocated and died. The men above assumed that their comrade had drowned, so they cut the anchored rope and then waited an hour and sailed away, leaving the anchor behind. The townsfolk, apparently proud of this deed, took the anchor and melted it down and made fittings for the church door. The final telling would come from a Norse document in the mid-13th century. Again, it's cited as taking place at this church in Clonmacnoise. On this Sunday, the people were at church attending Mass when all of a sudden, from the air dropped an anchor on a rope. That anchor got hooked onto the arch of the church door, which startled the people and they ran outside to see what was going on. Above, they seen a ship floating around with the rope running to it, and on the ship, men were moving about. One man leaped overboard and dove down to loosen the anchor, and while he did so, it looked like he was swimming in the air. He then began trying to loosen the anchor when some of the men in church grabbed him. However, the bishop, who was there just by chance, ordered the men to let him go, saying he would drown as if he was in water. So they did as they were told, and the man quickly swam back to the ship, and soon the rope was cut and the ship sailed away. And ever since then, the anchor has remained there as evidence for this event. So regardless of which version is true, it's an absolutely crazy story that seemed to get crazier as the years wore on. And what's even crazier is practically all the accounts came from second and third hand witnesses, which definitely adds doubts to the claims. Regardless, something most likely happened, and then folklore and myth added to it over the years and made it more fanciful than what it really was. The sighting was viewed as a one-off for over 1,000 years before more reports started popping up in the US and Canada in 1896 and 1897. And if you have watched any of the regional series on this channel, like the Southern or Midwest, you will probably be familiar with the airship phenomenon, which dominated the American continent for 2 years. And yes, in some of those accounts, anchors were dropped down. Although many of these stories were straight up hoaxes, some were deemed pretty reputable at the time. One of the more famous ones happened in Merkel, Texas, when churchgoers were leaving one Sunday night, and allegedly they came across a rope and anchor being dragged across the countryside until it snagged on a railroad track. They then looked up to see an airship with lights shining from their windows. While they were there staring at this marvel, a man climbed down the rope, cut it away from the anchor, and the ship flew on away, where it was reported later to have been seen above a local blacksmith shop. While another famous sighting happened in Nova Scotia in 1796, but this time there was a fleet of 15 ships that were said to be sailing over the Bay of Fundy. But what really happened in the case of the original one? That will probably never be explained, although there are theories. For one, it could have just been an unusual cloud formation that gave the illusion that it was a ship. In fact, ship-shaped clouds were recorded by monks in the 13th century, so it wouldn't be that odd. Another theory is they just happened to see the northern lights, something they had no idea about, and the colorful display of shapes and patterns just really surprised them, and then was embellished over the years. I have to point out too, a lot of these stories have religious themes, as you may have noticed, which probably added a layer to the story. And of course, I have to throw out the paranormal theory that it was aliens, but now the most plausible explanation is that of an ocean mirage, which is a phenomenon that makes it look like ships at sea are well above the horizon. Lake Okeechobee of South Florida covers about 730 square miles, which makes it the 10th largest body of fresh water in the US, but it's also one of the most shallow in the country, averaging around 9 foot deep. It's had a long connection to the weird and unexplained phenomena going back for decades, and that might be why many of the Native Americans never really settled in large numbers near the lake. It's actually the early settlers that would first call this place home, and it's these settlers that would first give accounts of our next mystery, because prior to 1910, the earliest pioneers would report finding human skeletons in the shallows around the southern end of the lake. Fishermen would often report pulling skulls up in their nets, claiming that there were so many that during the low water, it was like looking down at a pumpkin patch. By the early 1900s, a surveyor was sent in to clear land on Grassy Island, where he documented finding more than 50 skeletons covered with just a couple inches of sand. And this was not a case of burials either, because this spot he was standing used to be a lake bottom, but the water level was dropped by a drainage canal. By 1918 though, the water level in the lake would drop to an all-time low due to a drought, and revealed hundreds of human remains laying at the silt bottom. They had not been placed there in an orderly fashion either, like in a burial. No, they were scattered, and the bones belonged to adults and children alike. So where in the world are all these remains coming from? Well, the first theory was an obvious one, an ancient hurricane. However, one problem with this is the fact that prior to 1900, very few people lived around Lake Okeechobee, which seemingly ruled out mass casualties from a flood or a storm. The next theory that's often brought up is the Seminole Wars, which was actually a set of 3 conflicts taking place between 1816 and 1858, and involved the United States fledgling government and the Seminoles and their allies. But only one skirmish took place near the lake, and that was the 1837 Battle of Okeechobee, which resulted in 30 dead total, thus ruling that out. Interestingly, there are no Spanish accounts on the bones, and historians believe that the remains have actually been around for thousands of years, while some speculate that it's the remains of a huge Indian village that was wiped out by warfare or disease. But that opens up another question. Where are the artifacts and pottery of this huge village? There are none found in the area, suggesting there's never been a village here. Some have suggested that a local tribe traveling through the area disposed of their dead over a period of years as part of a ritual and anchored them to the bottom of the lake. But this contradicts the bones being found scattered. After this, the theories get a little bit more wild, with one suggesting that 200 Seminole warriors slit their own throats and launched themselves into the water to avoid capture by the American forces. But this story is by most accounts a legend, and it's not even sure that the story was supposed to have happened at this lake. Others cite a legendary lost tribe that are referenced to by other Native Americans, and then you get the paranormal ones like refugees from Atlantis or aliens. May 1981, Neutraubling in southern Germany. A dentist named Dr. Kurt Backseitz was at work in his clinic when the telephone began to ring. When he answered it, he heard only a low guttural voice screaming obscenities at him. Kurt hung up, being a little confused, and if it had been a one-time thing, it would be no big deal. But this was just the beginning, because these calls would continue to come in, following the same pattern, a deep voice hurling insults. But it wasn't just Kurt that got this abuse. His wife, Margot, and 16-year-old assistant, Claudia, both of whom helped at the office, would also be subjected to this abuse. Kurt and Margot were always insulted, but Claudia was talked to in perverse ways before the man began telling her that he loved her. It would be sometime after this point, he would begin referring to himself as Chopper, and over the following weeks, the calls began to increase. which of course put the doctor in a bad spot, and he would go on to report the harassment. Technicians were sent to the office where they set up an intercept circuit on the lines in hopes of tracing the cause. For a time, they stopped, but reporting this would soon blow up in the face of the dentist, because this caused the harassment to escalate in a strange way. Now, instead of calling the office directly, anytime the doctor called out, Chopper would interrupt the call and began screaming obscenities again. He had somehow been able to tap into the lines. This escalated the issue, and more time and money was spent trying to run down this Chopper and figure out how he was doing this. Soon, the phone cables and phones were all replaced at the clinic, but the very first call made on this equipment was interrupted by Chopper, who informed the dentist that he still had a clear line. This continued for the following months, and his behavior got even weirder. He began making comments about what 16-year-old Claudia was doing outside the office, like he had been stalking her, and he soon threatened that he would kill her. Now law enforcement became very interested, especially since there had been a string of murders that had targeted younger girls. 4 months prior to this, in July, a 13-year-old, Sonia Hurler, was abducted and then found deceased 3 months later. She had been strangled and assaulted. Then, Ursula Herrmann, as you may remember, we covered that one in the Unsolved mega series here recently, was also abducted and murdered. And in that case, you might recall the strange phone calls with the recording of the radio jingle that her parents received. It was because of all this that law enforcement in Germany was no longer screwing around when it came to Chopper. They began searching the neighborhood surrounding Dr. Backsight's home, and they soon found a ham radio enthusiast whose raspy voice really made him look like a suspect. Police then began intercepting his calls and soon found it was not him. 3 months later, in February 1982, it got even stranger when Dr. Backsights and Claudia told police they now heard Chopper's voice coming from the clinic's plumbing. They stated it happened multiple times throughout the day, often coming from the sink drain, electrical outlets, and light fixture. And at least on one occasion, a lady using the restroom would be terrified when a voice began shouting, and the voice sounded like it was coming from the toilet. And of course, he was hurling obscenities again. Now the story was being spread all over Germany, and this brought out the more supernatural types, who insisted the thing was actually a ghost, and that the office was haunted. Soon, paranormal investigators arrived on site and witnessed the phenomena, and it was around this time that Chopper began to fixate on Claudia alone. She was his center of attention, and because of this, she was invited to appear on talk shows and even recorded a pop song about him. The police were still not taking it lightly though, as they continued on with their investigation, and they were at the clinic and began seeing this poltergeist-type activity, such as furniture moving by itself or Chopper talking, and it was then that they noticed something. Every time Chopper appeared, Claudia's back was turned, and at one point, an officer even caught Claudia's reflection in a mirror and noticed her lips moving in sync with Chopper's voice. After this, they were all taken in for interrogation, where Claudia admitted to faking some of it, but claimed a real Chopper had initially began harassing them. Dr. Kurt Backsights also confessed to participating too, although he claimed he did it subconsciously. How they pulled off the phenomena is still unknown, but it is believed they went as far as hiding speakers to pull off some of the tricks, as well as using ventriloquism. As far as the plumbing went, it is believed they used a tape recorder or tubes that connected to the pipes where they could then transmit the sound, but there was no evidence of this found. In the end, they were all fined and the case was closed. The clinic shut its doors after this, and the stress from the case caused Dr. Kurt and his wife to admit themselves to a mental hospital. Claudia would also change her name to get away from the notoriety. This story was taken from the Shrouded Hand YouTube channel, and it's pretty crazy. As far as theories go, it sounds pretty much like it's already concluded, but from what I could gather, Claudia claimed to originally have gotten anonymous calls from someone using a disguised voice, which led to her starting the Chopper phenomena. And that's where our mystery comes in. Folie à deux, a weird phenomenon where delusions can affect a group of people. It's just possible that the doctor and his wife became so overwhelmed by the original calls that they subconsciously joined Claudia in keeping it going. possibly due for mental exhaustion themselves. Of course, this doesn't explain how the furniture and objects at the office were reportedly moving by themselves, and that has left the door open to a poltergeist being involved. In the time that we have made our journey across the world of the unexplained, we have covered numerous bizarre and weird humanoid encounters, but one that we have never covered that is pretty obscure is the Glimmer Man, and it's so obscure that I can't even find a page for it on the Cryptid Wiki or any of those paranormal wikis, although it does have a Reddit to pull stories from, as well as a few isolated stories from around the web, so we'll take a look at one of those. This one comes from a woman who gave her story to the phantomsandmonsters.com website in 2021. In the story, she would recall her childhood growing up at 5 years old in Illinois when this story takes place. She was at her grandmother's playing along the edge of the yard where the property met the forest. Her grandmother sat inside of the house and kept an eye on her from the huge window in the kitchen which faced the woods, and every now and then she would walk out and check on her. The woman would recall that she was digging in the dirt looking for unusual rocks and arrowheads since they were all over the place because this woman grew up not far from the Cahokia Mounds. After she had dug a decent-sized hole, something caught her eye up in the tree next to her. She described it as sort of looking like a heat wave coming off the branch of the tree. She continued to stare and realized that this heat wave was in the shape of a human. She began to wonder why an invisible man was sitting in the tree. She got scared but was unsure what to do. It's then that it began moving and making a faint clicking sound. This was enough to send the young child running back to her grandmother, whom she would tell she had just seen an angel. Her grandmother, of course, chalked it up to a child's imagination, but it would be 7 years later, when she was 12, that her father rented a movie called Predator, and she watched it with him. And it was there she seen the predator turn invisible, or cloak itself, and the memory flashed back to her, which led to her asking her dad if there was any animal that really had that ability, and her father told her no. Fast forward until she was an adult in 2004, and she now had children of her own, and one night she would step outside to smoke a cigarette. It was there while she was relaxing that she heard the faint clicking sound again, and a slight shift of movement near the porch. She turned to see again a distorted humanoid shape. She panicked and ran in and slammed the door and locked it, checked on her kids, and then looked out the window, but she could not see it. Although the neighbor's dog did come over and bark at the limb this thing had been sitting on, and this dog was usually not aggressive, but whatever was in this tree sure set him off. But it finally stopped, and she has never seen the creature again. This report is just one of many similar ones. Basically, it's always reported that it is covered in some kind of invisibility cloak that mirrors the predator. So what are people seeing? We'll start with the more supernatural theories first. One of the most offered suggestions is that this entity is interdimensional or an alien that has the technology to manipulate light or cloak themselves, which allows them to be mostly invisible. The next line of thought in the more paranormal realm of things is that of a ghost or shadow person, because in the accounts of the shadow people, they are often described as appearing to flicker or distort before they vanish completely. They're also said to be curious beings, which might explain why the so-called Glimmer Man does nothing more than observe. Next, we go to the cryptid realm, where like the others, it's just some kind of humanoid-like cryptid that can cloak itself. Another one that's a little crazy, but not too paranormal, is these events were all orchestrated by humans, and that they have came into the possession or are testing out an invisibility cloak. It's actually a concept that's been in research for many years, so it's not too far out of the realm of possibility. Now, we finish with the most likely scenario. Was it something psychological? Maybe these people hallucinated, or in some cases, fell asleep and had a vivid dream, or sleep paralysis. The brain can do tricky things when one is stressed, tired, and or is suffering from high emotions or anxiety. And like our story with this woman, when she seen the being the second time as an adult, she did state she had been going through a separation with her husband at that time. Add into the fact that your eyes can play tricks on you in the night, especially in forested areas, and conditions like humidity and temperature can make things appear to glimmer, which might make you see something appearing and then disappearing. Alright guys, we are now at the Small Mystery Roundup, and if you have watched long enough, you know what that is. So let's jump right into it. Memories of the Statue of Liberty moving. This one is more of a meme theory that was found on X, the paranormal board on 4chan, which references a YouTuber by the name of Zero Fats Returns, who claimed that the Statue of Liberty moved, and was another symptom of the Mandela effect. Basically, he went on to claim that the Statue of Liberty is now on Liberty Island, but when he was a child and in school, they were taught that it was on Ellis Island. He also stated, not long ago, you could take tours through the arm and torch of the Statue of Liberty. But that's not been the case for decades. After a German sabotage attack on a munitions plant on New York City's Black Tom Island caused fragments to slam into the Statue of Liberty, causing damage to the rivets to connect the arm and torch, making it too dangerous to go up into the arm and torch. I wasn't able to find if he was the one that originally came up with this theory, or if it had been online before, but regardless, according to the naysayers, this is just another instance of false memory, or perhaps geographic ignorance, and they're just unwilling to admit they were wrong, and thus fall back on the Mandela effect. The next one is another meme conspiracy theory called 9/11 happens every year. This one I couldn't find much about, but according to the obscure Iceberg, it's a reference to a meme entry on an old conspiracy iceberg that was posted on the paranormal board of 4chan. From what I can find, it's more of a play on words than anything else, like 9/11 happens every year obviously, but not every year does an event like what happened in 2001 happens. That's basically it. And that's all for the Small Mystery Roundup. But before we get back to the video, if you would like to support the channel, I do have a Patreon at Insomnia TV. Now let's get back to it. When it comes to tales of alien abductions, we all have an image of these taking place in the modern day, as the term itself didn't become widespread until the 1960s, but has prompted some UFO researchers to wonder, did this not ever happen before? Which then led to looking back through time to try to find some instances of this. The ones uncovered and documented would then be termed by UFO researcher Jerome Clark as Paleoabductions. It's these cases we're going to take a look at. The first goes all the way back to November 1896 in Stockton, California, when a newspaper would cover the story of a Colonel H.G. Shaw who stated he and a friend were being harassed by 3 tall, slender humanoids whose bodies were covered in a fine, soft hair, and these beings were apparently trying to abduct them. After this, it would be another half a century before we have anything similar to it, when in October 1953, an article penned in the Man to Man magazine would ask, "Are the flying saucers kidnapping humans?" Inside the article, it was speculated that a few unlucky people were being captured like butterflies with a net, perhaps to be studied or dissected, or maybe even killed. 2 years later in 1955, a publication entitled Flying Saucers Uncensored brought up 2 men already known in the UFO community, A. Carl Hunrath and Wilbur Wilkinson. Both men were known for their crazy claim that they had been contacted by aliens, but strangely enough, they completely vanished under weird circumstances, and in this publication, it was alleged that they had been abducted. Of course, when it comes to abduction stories, the biggest early story was that of Betty and Barney Hill, a story of 1961, but there was at least one other huge abduction case that predates this one, and it's not well known in America, that of Antonio Vilas Boas, who in 1957 was a Brazilian farmer working during the night to stay out of the smothering summer heat. One night, as he was plowing his fields, he seen a red star in the sky which approached his position, and it became recognizable as an egg-shaped aircraft. He went on to claim that it began to land, extending 3 legs to the ground. Antonio fled the scene on his tractor when suddenly it died a short few feet away, causing him to jump off and flee on foot. But he was soon captured by a 5-foot-tall humanoid wearing gray overalls and a helmet. He claimed it had small blue eyes and made noises like barks and yelps. On board, 3 similar beings began to subdue him. Once inside, he was stripped and covered with a strange gel, taken back to a semicircular room through a doorway with strange red symbols. They then took blood from his chin and put him in another room where they left him alone for half an hour, where a gas was pumped into the room, making him very sick. After this, he was joined by another humanoid. This one was a female, very attractive and very naked. And if you think this story has been bizarre thus far, strap in, because this female humanoid had a small pointed chin and large blue cat-like eyes, which was set off by her long white, sorta platinum blonde hair, which Antonio thought weird because her underarm and pubic hair were bright red. Antonio was so smitten with her that he couldn't resist his biological urges, and the two went at it right there, but he was disappointed she did not kiss him, instead softly biting him on the chin. When it was over, she gestured to her belly as if she was pregnant, and he strangely noted she seemed relieved that the dirty job was over. He was then given his clothing and given a tour of the ship, and then escorted off and watched it fly away and discovered that 4 hours had passed. I don't even know what to say about this one, other than this makes the alien abduction sound fun, minus the violently ill part. Anyways, I don't know what the mystery is now, but it is worth pointing out, this case, and the Hill case, would go on to basically be the template for all alien abduction stories afterwards, which made it easy for skeptics to poke holes in it, considering the stories rarely deviate from this format. On a winter morning in 1936, in Pavlodar, Kazakhstan, a 15-year-old girl named Loznaya was walking to school along an isolated path when she would encounter something truly unexplainable. In the sky, she would notice a strange-looking, medium-sized man dressed in black overalls flying. The man, who had his face obscured by a helmet, was wearing an oval-shaped apparatus on his back that looked like a rucksack, but emitted a low rumbling noise. While she marveled at who this man was and how exactly he was flying, he suddenly shifted directions and started flying towards her. Unfortunately, she could not run in the snow, and she began trying to find a place to hide instead. She would look up again to see how close he was, and that's when she realized he had vanished. Now the problem with this little mystery here is the obvious. The first working prototype of a jetpack wouldn't pop up until the 60s, almost 30 years after this account, although designs for a jetpack had been made as early as 1919, but it's not likely that a jetpack could have been created by 1936, and if it had been, it would have most likely been a secret military prototype, which begs the question, why was this man flying around in the open? Which has led to the question, what exactly did this girl see that day? Well, there's not a lot of theories on this little known mystery, but some theories suggest it was actually an alien humanoid of some sort exploring the planet, while other conjecture cites the young girl somehow fell into a time slip where she saw into the future. Others, of course, cite the whole story is a hoax. 1982, Titusville, Florida. Excavation would begin on a road in a new housing development which sat right across from a muck pond. As the backhoe operator was moving dirt away, something caught his eye. Right in the bucket were several skulls. He immediately stopped, and soon the sheriff, along with the medical examiner, were called in. It was probably an unsettling feeling, waiting to see how long these people had been buried here, and was it the work of a serial killer? However, the tension soon fell when it was discovered these were not recent burials. Actually, they were very old, dating back to around 7000 BC, meaning it was built before the Great Pyramids of Egypt even began their construction. The developers of this project deserve credit here too, because they totally changed their plans so they could preserve the pond and even donated $60,000 worth of equipment for archaeologists to continue their research. When it was carried out by the professors from Florida State University, the location would become known after this as the Windover Pond Archaeological Site, and it would become a very rare discovery for a few reasons. For one, these remains were very, very old. Secondly, it's not often you find underwater burials where everything is preserved so well, which has to do with it being buried in the peat itself, which is basically an accumulation of partially decayed vegetation or organic matter. The most significant find was there were 168 individuals buried here, ranging from infants to 60-year-olds. There's even been brain matter recovered, which has led to DNA testing, and that revealed they were very similar to the indigenous populations in South America. Even stranger is that the testing revealed that out of the 168 people, all but one seemed to be connected by blood. Along with that, they found evidence that one of these was an elderly woman who had been receiving long-term care, which suggests the group had a very strong bond. I'm not sure what the mystery is on this one, but I think it's supposed to be exactly how these people got here and who they were, because they don't actually fit into the overall broader picture of early human migration to the Americas. In fact, this site is much older than a lot of the traditional Clovis sites, which are supposed to be some of the earliest people to come to the Americas. So did these people of Windover come over the Bering Land Bridge in one single migration wave, or did they come with multiple groups at different times? And why did some of them end up in South America and these ended up in Florida? Likewise, the belief was that these early populations were nomadic, but from everything found at this archaeological site, it appears as if they had something similar to civilization. 1992, Yorkeys Knob, Queensland, Australia. An unnamed 60-year-old woman would have quite the shock when she looked out her window to see something she could have never expected. There, near a paddock just lumbering around like an elephant, was some kind of creature that resembled a giant bee, one that was about the size of an adult man. But that wasn't the only odd thing this lady seen, because right above it in the sky in the background, she could make out another object. She got up and went to the window and looked, and spotted a flat white square within a square that she believed seemed to be in telepathic communication with this bee for a lengthy period. Then, about that time, 2 jets flew nearby the square. That's pretty much it on this one. It's super obscure, partially due to the fact that the woman only relayed this story to her children and a few UFO researchers under the agreement she would remain anonymous, as she did not want to ruin her reputation in the community. For theories, we have the obvious ones. This could have been a vivid dream, or sleep paralysis, since the woman did mention that she had been in bed watching the events play out. Or, it's possible, she really did see something in the sky, maybe an experimental aircraft, possibly even a very early drone, since this was 1992. And of course, that doesn't really explain the giant bee. Finally, let's take a paranormal stab at this and say this was a legit UFO sighting that also involved an encounter with an unknown entity, and the two were somehow communicating. 1969, Buttercup Lane, Dunstable, England, would play host to our very next obscure paranormal mystery. The details are scarce, but basically, all I could find was a story from 2 witnesses, both men walking down a road called Buttercup Lane, when they suddenly seen one of the most bizarre entities we have covered yet. There, walking down the road, was a legless and armless shape wearing a large hat just drifting along. This being was about 6.5 foot tall and changed color from white to black, and like a lot of these cases thus far, there's very little info about it. The account comes from paranormaldatabase.com, where very few details are kept about the case, so it leaves much to the imagination. Although, I was able to find at least one more account of the weird humanoid, which changed some of the details. In this version, it states there have been several reportings over the years, and it's described as being close to 10 foot tall and floats about 1.5 feet off the ground. It wears a big wide-brimmed hat and is shrouded in a glowing mist, which changes color from white to black and disguises any outline of arms or legs as it glides along. And that's pretty much it, so we'll get right to theories. As far as the more sensible ones go, there's not a lot here. Of course, the 2 original men could have just shared a hallucination, or it could be whatever they did see was just a normal animal, but because of the trees and the darkness, or something like that, it could have just been an illusion. Of course, the whole story may be nothing more than a local urban legend. In fact, there's supposed to be a bunch of reported sightings, yet I could not find any detailed accounts. Next, we have the theory that it was a supernatural being. Since it had no legs or arms, it sounds very similar to a ghost. That could also explain its fluid movement, as it was described as gliding down the road. Of course, the question then becomes, why is this ghost tied to this one certain road? Next would be the alien theory. The description is clear about this thing being tall, somewhere between 6.5 to 10 feet tall, and that could match up with the humanoid type of description of some aliens, while the hat may have been some piece of technology it was using. Prophecy is a strange game. Most say predicting the future is impossible, and anyone intending to do so are just grifters. But we do occasionally get prophets that become famous for those predictions, notably Nostradamus, who is said to have made several accurate ones, although his detractors point out that his claims are very vague, which allowed them to be applied to just about anything. But in the modern day, anyone with an internet connection can be a prophet, or at least attempt to be, and that's what our next mystery is about. And it revolves around a series of posts made on Usenet at alt.prophecies.nostradamus by a poster named Xinoephoel. On August 31st, 2001, he would make a new post with the subject line 9/11, and in this post, which is a little convoluted and full of hate, he would claim that something would happen on the following day of September 1st, which he then proceeded to call the news group liars and told them he hated them, and then further stated they were going to get him killed for telling the truth. Well, that sounds like just a bunch of gibberish. He finished with something quite interesting. He would state, "I am not going to tell you what is going to happen until it does, because an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign." But the following day, on September 1st, nothing would happen. So he would follow up on this 3 days later, on September 4th, by replying to another poster saying, "Wait 7 days, and then maybe I'll answer this post. You see, I am going away in 7 days, and you will not hear from me again." And, of course, 7 days later would be the terror attacks of 9/11, and this Usenet group was freaked out by his post, with some claiming he had predicted 9/11, while others speculated darker possibilities, like he knew it was coming because he was made aware of the plans, or basically that he was a terrorist. He would return to the sub later that evening, where he continued to speak in cryptic messages, claiming he was innocent, but this was God's punishment for America. Although later on he corrected this and stated that it was the United States that was actually behind the attacks. In the weeks that followed, his posts were analyzed and spread all over the internet, and it kind of went viral. But many pointed out his posts were very vague and they could be applied to anything. And as mentioned previously, this is something that prophets typically do, because they know people will go back and try to connect the dots and make them fit any number of events. That's a phenomenon known as retrofitting, and that's still pretty much the main theory to this day. Not to mention, his first prediction said it would occur on September 1st, not September 11th, although some claim him coming back a few days later and stating that he would disappear on the 11th was supposed to be him clarifying his prediction, and that he was totally right. Alright everyone, that brings us to the end of part 11 of the Obscure Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg Explained. We are about 1/4 of the way through the 4th layer. I hope you all enjoyed. Goodbye, and good night.